Good afternoon. Welcome to the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast, live from the Facebook main page. My name is Andrew Kremen, and joining me as guest co-host today is James Peters. James, welcome.
G'day, Andrew. How are you going?
I'm good. It's good to see you. A climate pact has been struck at COP26 in Glasgow. The first half of the century will be characterised by the phasing out of fossil fuels. What will this mean for Australia? Talking to us about this is Denis Porter, former CEO of the New South Wales Minerals Council and author of the two-volume series Coal, The Australian Story. Denis Porter, welcome to Sunday Sessions.
Thanks, Andrew and James. Thank you.
It's good to have you on. Now, as always, you can post your questions in the comments section and we'll ask Denis as many of them as we can throughout the hour. Firstly, what is COP26? How does it impact Australia?
Andrew, if we go back to, I think it was 1992 when we had under the United Nations, there was the Framework Climate Change Convention, the UNFCCC it was called. That led to what have become annual meetings of the COP, Conference of the Parties. And, this is number 26. So it's been a long, pretty arduous process for all sorts of people involved in that. So that 1992 convention was a very significant one. And as we've seen now with COP26 in Glasgow, things are still moving and the pressure is on for change. The impact on Australia, we could go on for a long time about this, but just perhaps at this stage in the introduction, I suppose the biggest impact for Australia, I think, is that COP26 forced the federal government and Scott Morrison to commit to net zero by 2050. I don't think that was going to happen as quickly as it did. And of course, now we've got much more with what's happened in the lead up to COP26 and the media from that. There's much more focus in Australia on the debate, which we now leading up to the 2022 election in the next, probably between March and May next year, and that'll be interesting to see where the debate takes us. So it's a pretty, a lot of people were disappointed with COP26. Some of the green groups, of course, complaining about Australia's role, but nevertheless, it's been very significant, and despite all the problems that people have been pointing to. So I guess that's just a brief comment on the first question there, Andrew.
Yeah. So, what did Mr Morrison actually agree to at COP26, and has anything that he said been legally binding?
Okay. Well, of course, it was net zero by 2050. He also talked about a commitment by 2030. The national commitment has been 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels, and he's now pointing, of course, to perhaps up to 35%. But that's not a firm commitment. That's more an indication. I think most people would be expecting Australia to exceed its formal commitment for 2030. In terms of legally binding, if we go back to the 2015 Paris Agreement, that was a legally binding international treaty where the signatories committed to hold global warming to less than 2% and to aim for no more than 1.5% increase in global warming. And each country has what's called its nationally determined commitments. In fact, although that treaty was legally binding, those nationally determined commitments are up to individual countries to set, and they're essentially voluntary. So what comes out of COP26 is not strictly legally binding, but I don't think that matters anymore for a country like Australia, which has taken its commitments very seriously, and with all the other things that are going on in the private sector and throughout the world and so on. I think whether something's now legally binding or not, I don't think carries a tremendous amount of weight.
Just following up from there, we noticed there was a bit of hesitation in the beginning from Morrison first jumping into net zero, and then he did make an agreement just before he went. Do you feel that with his background from where he's came from, but also what Morrison's position was going into the 2019 election, that he's come out with a different plan compared to what most other countries at COP26 have had?
Yes, I think there are, his plan certainly now, and that's much more clear, I think, in recent days, where he's now talking, I think, with a view to the election about governments not trying to tell people what to do, but giving them options and investing money in certain areas to get the costs of new technologies down and so on. The Europeans are probably much more into command and control, setting regulations and so on. And I think we'll see, we'll probably see some sort of distinction between Labor and the coalition with the election that's coming up shortly. So look, I'm not sure whether I quite answered that question there, James, but yes, I mean, Morrison is taking us down a certain path. Lot of Commonwealth investment in promoting new technologies. Not a lot of use of what we might call market mechanisms. I think one of the questions we've got later on is to look at that in a little bit more detail. But nevertheless, it's a valid thing to do. A lot of people, I think, have overlooked, some of the media have overlooked that this hasn't just happened overnight. If you go back to last year, some of the material that now the government has been fleshing out in terms of these new technologies, that appeared first in about June, when they put out the initial technology roadmap. And it's very clear from that hydrogen and low-cost solar and so on are key to it. Coal hardly got a mention in that. And it's been very clear for a couple of years now that the Commonwealth Government is not keen on pushing new coal-fired power stations, although some in the National Party would like to see that, of course. So, we've had this developing plan now with Morrison and Angus Taylor as the Energy Minister, which has really been going on for the best part of 18 months or more, probably more than that, because probably the bureaucracy's been working on it for longer than that. So quite significant, I think, what's been happening, and different to what many other countries will be doing.
And just one last follow-up there in terms of that, you mentioned about going into new coal power stations. I'm sure you'd know that there's a feasibility study on a power station to be built up in Queensland, but do you think the government will continue forward with that, or with this new plan, it seems like that is now just off the cards?
Look, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether the study is going ahead. If it does, I'm not sure that will actually mean much. I suppose to maintain faith with the National Party, he made that commitment a while back, so I assume the study will go ahead. But even if it comes out, with some sort of recommendation that that there might be potential for a coal-fired power station, I don't know who's going to fund it. The banks in Australia are not interested. In fact, if you look through the major banks, they've all made commitments now that basically by 2030 they're out of coal, be it coal mining or coal-fired power stations. State governments are probably not going to be interested. Queensland's got an interesting mix of coal-fired power stations as it is, and we might get on for that later. But I don't think, even if that study was to go ahead and be finalised and give some people hope, I can't see a new coal-fired power station coming out of it. I think there's also the question of, given that the trend to renewable energy is going to continue, I mean, there's no question about that. So solar and wind and pumped hydro and batteries and so on will dominate the system. That means that coal is probably not the ideal source for energy when it's only being used intermittently. Although gas is expensive, gas is a much better source of power when you've got to turn it off and turn it on all the time just to meet the gaps for hours or days when those renewables are not available. So for a number of reasons, I don't think we're going to see any more new coal-fired power stations in Australia, including one in Queensland.
You've covered this already somewhat in some of your answers, but specifically, like, what is net zero? What does that properly look like for Australia in the future? Okay,
and maybe if I just refer to I don't want to talk about figures too much, but I think it's useful if we go back to the last detailed statistics that were produced for Australia on our emissions, and it's in terms of millions of tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And in 2019, we emitted approximately 545 million tonnes. But we also we took out of the atmosphere in what's a category called land use change and forestry about 26 million tonnes. So if you deduct the 26 from 545, you come down to about 519. And the 519 breaks up to in a number of ways. Electricity is about 35% of that. And of course, we know that coal and gas dominate that, so that's a big source of emissions. Road transport is just over 16%. Fugitive emissions, which largely are from a number of sources, but the big ones would be methane emissions from coal mining and methane emissions from natural gas in the Northwest Shelf and other areas. That's almost 10%. Agriculture is about 13.5%. So we've got some very significant contributors to emissions right across the economy. The big one, of course, is electricity. We know about that and we know where that comes from. Road transport, and a big chunk of road transport, of course, is motor vehicles that we all drive, but it also includes the commercial vehicles and the heavy trucks and so on. And as I've said, we've got fugitive emissions, agriculture, and a lot of emissions from general industry and so on. So it's spread throughout the economy. And of course, the net is the gross less what we take out through soil carbon that might go into soils, forest where we plant trees, and forests are absorbing carbon and so on. So that's just a quick few numbers. Might just help put the thing in perspective.
Apart from suggested benefits for the climate, are there other benefits to renewable energy? So, for example, jobs, national security, or does it put Australia at a disadvantage in other ways?
Okay, look, there are a number of ways to look at that question, I think, Andrew. One is in terms of the domestic economy, and a lot will depend on the costs. If renewables give us a competitive electricity system and low costs in other areas, then it should be a good thing for the economy. Another key aspect, I think, is if you looked at the government's plan that was published recently for how we're going to meet the net zero by 2050. A key aspect of that is the growth which the government and the consultants they use see in the growth in minerals and metals that will service a global demand for products that rely on renewables, or things like electric vehicles. And we're talking here of copper, which has huge uses in motor vehicles, in wind turbines and so on, in electricity distribution systems. So we're talking of copper, we're talking of lithium for batteries, we're talking of nickel for batteries, and there are some other products as well. They're probably three of the biggest ones. And the forecasts in that 2050 plan were very optimistic for those things, and they're looking to the growth in exports of those minerals and metals to hopefully offset what might happen to perhaps a decline in coal exports, and I'm not sure about natural gas. Another area is hydrogen. If the government wants to get the cost of producing hydrogen way down for a number of purposes, some people think that Australia can become a world exporter of hydrogen. I'm not so sure. I think I'd rely on people with a lot more expertise than I have, and because hydrogen is not something that's easy to ship. But there's potential to use hydrogen in Australia in steelmaking, in the aluminium industry, in the production of ammonia. And hydrogen is a major component of ammonia and so on. So those benefits of renewables, as I say, in terms of a lot of industries, it will depend on whether we still have a cost-effective, internationally competitive system, particularly in power generation. And another side of it is we're going to become a major supplier for copper, lithium, nickel, and so on in hopefully around the world. So we've got to look at a number of aspects, I think.
As a follow-up, we've got an audience question. How will this impact mining? Will we see an uptake in mining as we expand renewables? Well,
I think in those, particularly those three I've mentioned, copper, lithium, and nickel, yes. I mean, if you look at some of the companies on the stock exchange, with currently producing or with potential projects, they're doing pretty well, and their shares have gone up quite substantially in recent times. So I think that the prospects there are good. I mean, there's plenty of lithium around the world, but we've got some good deposits. We've got good infrastructure in Australia, so I think we should be able to come out for that fairly well. Western Australia will probably be the state that will benefit most out of those, but Queensland possibly. Not sure about New South Wales and Victoria, but there's good prospects there, I think, for exports. Yeah.
So, Denis, following the Glasgow conference, did it seem like Morrison was trying to appease both sides of not only the net zero debate, but also people in the mining industry and still within those primary and secondary industries. And was that a bit of a mistake on Scott Morrison's part by not actually taking a clear path forward? It seems a little bit too cloudy in terms of where we're going forward.
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question, James. Look, my own view is that he had no option but to do what he's done. Now, if some people feel he didn't go far enough, well, that's let's see where that leads us. But public opinion has been moving, I think, in the last couple of years strongly in favour of more action on climate change. And I think if you look at major issues of concern out there in the public, from what you read in the media, climate change now has come near or to the top of those concerns, above other things like jobs and so on. So I don't think he had any option. I think we also need to look at what some of the threats were out there. We've got the threat in the next few years of border taxes or border adjustment mechanisms that the Europeans are going to introduce, where they potentially would tax products that come from countries which I believe not to be doing enough on climate change. We've got the strong action by the banks in Australia and overseas, large fund managers, superannuation funds, insurance companies, and so on. They've all come out strongly in terms of supporting action on climate change, and many of them saying, look, we don't want to be associated with coal, and we're going to get out of coal, in a certain time frame. Josh Frydenberg has been making the point recently that if Australia doesn't go down this path, that there's the threat of higher interest rates, and because we could be locked out of some capital markets internationally, and that would be a bad thing for Australia. And also, if we look at companies across the board here, we've got mining companies, the BHPs of the world, retailers, energy companies, and so on. You could go on. Not all, but many of them committing to action by 2030 or action by 2050. So with all of these things, public opinion, threats by people like the EU, action in the private sector, I think it's all heading one way. Whether Morrison has got the right balance, I think we'll find out in the next 6 months with the election. I can't answer that one. I don't know.
If I can ask, you mentioned that European countries may impose additional taxes on countries they perceive as not doing enough on climate change. I know the World Economic Forum, they're looking at a potential, it's either a credit or a debit card that would essentially give you a limit on your carbon footprint. So your purchases are linked to your carbon footprint. And then if you sort of go past a certain amount, you cannot actually pay for those goods. Like, is this something that could potentially find its way? I suppose into Australia. It's something they're looking at.
Oh, I hadn't heard of that one. I don't know. That's there's all sorts of things which countries or companies might want to introduce. I'm not sure about that. The world is moving fast with policies and actions and so on. So we might be talking about this in 5 years' time or 1 year time, and things have changed very, very rapidly. I don't know, but I think we can look forward to continuing change and continuing new initiatives. Yeah.
Following up on the international discussion here, especially with how Australia is looking on the international stage, you mentioned just briefly before about BHP, and we knew a few years ago that BHP actually removed themselves even from the World Coal Organization, as they're starting to say, look, we're wanting to phase out of coal. But as a downside from that, what we're actually seeing is that a lot of these big mining companies like BHP, Rio Tinto, Yancoal, and the list goes on, they're holding the coal mines just in caretaker mode without actually going through the rehabilitation process. While in the US, we have all these companies over there that are going through and doing the high wall mining process to fund the rehabilitation process. Do you think that we'll get to a point in Australia that unless we start looking into stuff like high wall coal mining, we will end up just with a lot of coal mines which are just stuck in caretaker mode and not rehabilitated?
Look, firstly, I'm not sure that you're right in terms of big companies leaving putting coal mines on sort of care and maintenance basis. I mean, BHP is still a big coal miner. They've still got half a dozen or more big metallurgical coal mines in Queensland, and that's not going to change. I mean, they did sell a couple of their mines that they had a joint venture with Mitsui, and they've been sold now, but they weren't the main part of BHP's business. So BHP, unless it makes a major change, is going to have metallurgical coal for steelmaking as part of it's one of its sort of pillars for some years to come. BHP still has a very big mine called Mount Arthur North in the Hunter Valley, and that's still producing, I don't know, 25, 30 million tonnes a year, and it's earning them a lot of money at the moment. They have had it on the market and haven't had it at a buyer. I suppose there's a buyer at a price, but BHP presumably wants to get more money. One of the things that disappoints me when companies like BHP and Rio Tinto, which is out of coal mining completely now, when the big companies like that move out of an industry and it's sold to other companies that might not have the strength, the financial strength, and the corporate governance and so on that the big ones have, you may not get the orderly transition away, from some industries that we should have. I mean, I'd be confident, for example, with BHP that over the long term that their mines in Queensland will be rehabilitated. When those mines close, there'll be the land will be, it won't be back to what it was originally, but it'll become quite useful land for grazing or crops and so on. And we see a lot of this already in the Hunter Valley, where land that's been mined, people don't realise it. Land that's been mined is now used for grazing and other purposes. But look, it's fact of life that companies, some of the big ones, are moving out. Smaller ones are taking up, or other private equity interests are taking up the shareholding in those mines. So I don't know if there's too much on a sort of being operated on a care and maintenance basis at the moment. Again, we're going to see more change. BHP presumably at some stage will sell out completely out of thermal coal, and we'll just continue with metallurgical coal.
You've mentioned, we're going to see more change. We've got a number of audience questions on your opinion on nuclear power.
Yep.
One, whether it's a viable alternative to coal power, and another one in regards to Nick Cater, we've previously interviewed, mentioning that nuclear probably won't be on the agenda because the public needs to make sure that the ground is clear, I suppose, in regards to renewables, and would be more confident. The ground is clear in regards to nuclear, and that the public would be more confident with it as an energy source. And so for that one, is that a good electoral strategy?
Okay, well, nuclear. Firstly, in terms of the current election, clearly, the coalition, although I suspect there are a number of Morrison's colleagues in Canberra who probably want to see nuclear on the agenda, but he's ruling it out. Labor, of course, is opposed. The Greens go ballistic if it's mentioned. One of the concerns I have long term with the electricity system in Australia is I'm not sure, and I'm not an expert, I'm just not sure whether a system that relies on solar, wind, pumped hydro and batteries will be enough to get us through. We'll have gas in the short to medium term, and maybe gas longer term, I don't know, but coal will be out probably by about 2040 or shortly after. And there are a lot of people out there who believe that nuclear has a role to play. It's an expensive system, but we've seen France now saying, look, it relies on nuclear for 70% of its electricity now and exports a lot to other countries. So that's a great help in Europe. But it's going to build some new stations. China will build more. There are a number of countries looking to build nuclear. Australia, I think the public in Australia is probably anti-nuclear at the moment, but I get a sense that a lot of people are at least prepared to consider it. So I would like to think in the next few years, we can start opening up the debate about nuclear and see whether it is a viable option. The Minerals Council of Australia, only in the last few weeks, have brought out a paper on small-scale nuclear. So we're not talking about the huge plants that you might see in countries like France or the UK, which might be 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts, massive things with the huge cooling towers. We're talking about plants which are very small, which will occupy quite a modest area for the plant and the surrounding facilities, which might produce between 70 and 300 megawatts. That could be a useful thing for Australia to have, because if we come, we saw what happened in Europe just recently, where we didn't have much wind, so wind wasn't supplying enough power. Gas prices had gone through the roof for a number of reasons, and they're actually trying to turn on coal-fired power stations to help with the system. So I think most Australians would think that we need to have a cost-effective, an economical and a reliable power system. Now, whether that has a role for nuclear in the future, I don't know, but I think we should be open to looking at it in more detail.
Just following up on that one there, Denis, I mean, we had a discussion prior to this that I grew up in the Hunter, and a lot of the Hunter relies on primary and secondary industry for their economy. For example, the Tomago aluminium plant is probably the favourite of the politicians at the moment to speak in their media conferences, but it uses 1/3 of Liddell Power Station's energy. Do you think we need a reliable source of energy like those small-scale reactors to be able to continue to promote our manufacturing industry in Australia?
Possibly, yes, possibly. I remember seeing some comments from the CEO of Tomago this year or last year, and he was clearly concerned about whether we'd have enough power, reliable power, and the so-called dispatchable power to continue. I mean, there have been quite a few times where Tomago has actually had to turn off its power, and it can do that for a few hours. But you get into a day, and the pot lines will set, and I don't think you could bring an aluminium smelter back from that situation. So I think people like the CEO up there are very worried. Nuclear may be, that's I guess what I was talking about a moment ago, that maybe we need nuclear to provide an element of support to the system. At the moment, we just don't know. I don't think whether there's a role for that. So I'd rely on comments like that. And I think also the CEO of BlueScope Steel, who run the Port Kembla Steelworks, has a similar view that he's worried about whether renewables can provide the reliable power that's required for those sort of facilities. It's a big issue, and a lot of people just blithely think that renewable solar and wind and so on can do it. Maybe they can, but we need to be sure.
That leads well to the next question. A common argument surrounding net zero is that if one wishes to pursue the phasing out of coal and other fossil fuels, the government would need to rely on market-oriented innovations that have already proven to be economically and environmentally feasible. What innovations are there that the country should be utilising?
Well, we had, I suppose, the most common market mechanism for this area would be an emission trading scheme, and we did have that, or the start of that a few years ago, and I think most economists would certainly, from a theoretical point of view, would say that emissions trading is a good way to go, and you set a limit on the amount of emissions that people are allowed, or the country is allowed, or industries are allowed, and they can trade within that, and it effectively becomes a form of tax, if you like. But the coalition have moved away from that. Labor doesn't want to pursue it anymore, so I think that's out of the question, certainly for the foreseeable future. One element which probably will be part of a scheme, whether we have a Labor or a coalition government in Australia, will be the trading of credits internationally. I mean, part of the government's plan for 2050 is to get a lot more carbon injected into farms and soil throughout the country. This gives farmers and landowners carbon credits. Whether to what extent they would be then used to help the national effort, or to what extent they could be used to be sold overseas, we don't know yet. Also, Australia could buy credits from other countries under certain conditions. So that's certainly a market mechanism. I think we'll see more of that as the years go on. At the moment, the coalition, I think, is largely going to rely on putting money into promoting hydrogen, low-cost solar, wanting to partner with the private sector to invest, and so on. I suppose that's there's got elements of market mechanism there, but so it's a mixed picture at the moment, I think. Yeah. Do carbon tariffs make sense from a national security perspective? Well, Well, for Australia, I think that the threat is that we'll see countries or blocs like the EU impose what is effectively a carbon tariff on other countries. As we mentioned before, that countries that are not seen to be doing the right thing or not seen to be taxing their own industries or restraining emissions. So that's a threat, and we need to be very careful that we do enough to minimise that or to avoid it. I can't see Australia in the foreseeable future imposing tariffs on anyone else. I think I don't think that's likely. If you look at the big sources of imports for Australia, products that might incorporate a lot of carbon, industrial machinery and so on. I mean, they come from all around the world. I think Australia would prefer, and we're probably not talking about a lot of competition with Australian production here, apart from things like the steel industry. I can't see Australia getting into that area, but as I say, the big threat is that countries like the EU, potentially the USA, putting up a wall, some sort of barrier or tax that would hurt us. We've got to be very careful going down that track.
And then as climate change has revealed quite a generational gap between older people reluctant to take net zero seriously, and then the young people, as evident with mass climate protests pushing for action intensively. Why do you see that happening?
It's probably part of the centuries-old generational difference between old and young. But I think a big difference between people in their 20s and 30s and younger kids, teenagers and younger kids, is that they've gone through an education system where there's been a lot more emphasis on environmental issues, sustainability and so on. And so they graduate from school, graduate from university and so on with very different views. When I went to school and uni, these weren't huge issues. I'm talking quite a few years ago now, of course. But so I think that's the big one, that the education system has given younger people they've become much more environmentally aware. I suppose we're also seeing the worrying signs in Australia of bushfires and weather and so on that the last couple of years have shown us. There was another point there I was going to make. I'll try and get back to it later. It's just slipped my mind, but I think that education issue is certainly a major one. I suppose. The other point is that people of your age, Andrew's age, have got many years to look ahead, and whereas I've got much more limited period. And so if you've got another 30, 40, 50 years of life ahead of you, and you can see a world that's changing and a lot of threats out there, you're much more likely to be worried and want to see some action than someone who's my age or older, who may not have that same life expectancy. That might be part of it too.
Some have argued that any attempts for a serious climate conference in Glasgow were hijacked by rent seekers and political opportunists. We were discussing before that some of what's been agreed to may not necessarily have the teeth that some activists may have wanted. Did we see any real positive change come from the conference?
Look, there were probably a lot of rent seekers and opportunists there. There's no question. They're probably there in every conference to a greater or lesser degree. Look, I think one of the things that was different this time, we had the G20 meeting only just before COP26. So you had the leaders involved in that. And things like a push to have some sort of major push on outlawing coal or phasing coal out quickly. I mean, that was clear from the G20 that wasn't going to happen. So when you got to COP26, I think that some of the broad parameters had been set by the leaders, and the country leaders were only there for the first couple of days, and then it was up to the bureaucrats and ministers and so on to take the more detailed negotiations forward. So I think G20 set the broad parameters. We saw that what was going to happen was not going to be anything that was going to be revolutionary. We did see it at the COP. Quite a large number of countries did commit or seemingly commit to phasing out coal in the 30s or in the 40s, but you need to look behind that and see what that really means. I mean, Indonesia was one of those countries that was part of that commitment, but I think it was talking about the 40s or beyond for coal. But Indonesia wants also other countries to pay for that transition, and that's not going to happen. So there are a lot of good words there, but sometimes those things don't actually translate into much action. So positive change from the conference. I guess from my point of view, it was largely where we thought it would end. I'll just read you something there was an article in the Australian yesterday from one of their journalists, Graham Lloyd, I think it was. He said, overall, the Glasgow meeting has followed a similar pattern of high expectations, false promises, dashed hopes, last-minute redemption, and just enough hope to keep the global caravan on the road. So a little bit cynical, but I suppose he's probably been to a few conferences and seen that. So, but I don't think we should downplay the significance of what's been happening. It is still significant. Yeah.
Just following up there with Andrew's question, talking about political opportunists and rent seekers arriving there at the COP26, there was quite a bit of debate going on there with a lot of people who are trying to get political point scoring, saying that we shouldn't be, and especially Morrison was making this point, that we shouldn't be forcing our the developed countries' renewable energy plans onto developing countries who are still going through that process. Do you see that this is slowly becoming a debate between sort of pragmatic ideas and then also political opportunities within these global conferences?
That's hard to say, but it probably. I mean, I think Morrison makes a very good point there that, and he talks about what's really going to help the transition to renewables is getting the costs down. I mean, a number of the developing countries still use oil for all or part of their power generation, which, you think that's crazy these days, particularly given the price of oil in recent times. Some of those countries probably don't have the land and the facilities which could accommodate solar power. But if countries like Australia, US, Europe, and so on can find ways to come up with cheap forms of generating power, then yes, those countries will pursue it. And it might be easier also then for the private sector to come in and help finance it, and for some of the developed countries to contribute to the cost. I think we've got to realise the reality sometimes of what will it take to bring change. I mean, we saw a country like India, which has a huge coal industry, highly dependent on coal mining and coal-fired power generation, absolutely refusing to have strong wording on the phase out of coal. It sees coal as a vital part of its energy for decades ahead, and you can't blame them for that. They're trying to provide electricity to 1.2 billion people. Some of those still don't have any power, so they're not going to just abruptly change direction, and they'll certainly introduce more renewables over time, solar and wind and so on. But it's going to be a much broader mix of energy sources: coal, maybe a bit of gas, maybe some nuclear, and the renewables. And Australia, I think, the countries have got to respect that. That's the reality of economies worldwide.
We have an audience question. What are your thoughts on fracking?
What are my thoughts on fracking? Well, look, fracking has been around for many years now. It gets some bad press, and certainly there are times probably when some of the companies using the fracking, which is the fracturing of the coal seam underground, probably sometimes they don't have the best practices and so on. But you've had independent scientists look at the issue in New South Wales and other states, and as far as I know, the consensus has been and continues to be that if it's properly managed, like another resource, it can be beneficial and it can be managed properly. So, I realise there is a lot of community angst out there about fracking, and I can appreciate farmers who see companies come on their land and start drilling wells. It can be pretty devastating. But as I say, properly managed fracking, can be beneficial to the farmer, producing some money and producing a resource for the country.
We've seen recently that Scott Morrison has released his new electric vehicle strategy, ruling out subsidies for the expansion of electric and hybrid vehicles, saying they expect only 30% of new sales to be electric vehicles by 2030. What does this mean for the push for net zero?
Well, electric vehicles are, if we go back to what I said earlier about the profile of emissions, I mean, motor vehicles are to account for a significant part of our emissions. So if emissions are going to come down, then you've got to do something about motor vehicles. Electric vehicles are going to be part of that. I think one of the big differences in the coming election will be the coalition policy, which we've seen just come out, versus Labor's policy. I suspect Labor will go much harder on electric vehicles, probably introduce or flag some emission standards for petrol vehicles and other things which they say will give us a much faster growth in the market for electric vehicles. I suspect that the coalition, if it gets back in, will actually toughen its policies on electric vehicles over time. And, we might come to 2030 and, a much higher proportion of sales than the 30% that's being flagged. Time will tell. I mean, if the cost of electric vehicles comes down, that'll be a great help. But as I say, I think there will be quite a difference in the policies of the two parties for the next election on this one. So it'll be interesting to see how voters react.
If I might ask, why does it seem like China gets a free pass in climate-related matters?
Well, good question. Australia gets slagged very often. I don't know. Some countries don't want to upset China. We see the way that Australia's been reacting with China versus New Zealand. New Zealand is much more low-key and accommodating to China. We've taken a pretty hard line. A country like Indonesia, probably countries like Malaysia and so on, they realise that China's a major market for them and a major supplier, so they don't want to upset it. So partly it's not wanting to upset one of the biggest economies in the world, number two or number one, depending on how you measure it, and a country that's only going to get more powerful and bigger in the next couple of decades. So, I mean, that's the reality. China has agreed to zero net by 2060, so it gives it plenty of time. But we all know that they're continuing to build power stations and continuing to increase their emissions, and will do so probably until about 2030. They'll then have to make some major changes. They are investing a lot in renewable energy, but I guess President Xi is realistic in that he wants to keep the Chinese people happy. He wants to see his economy keep growing. He can't afford to have any major domestic unrest if he's going to continue to have the Communist Party in control. So China will be there. The interesting thing, I think, will be to see what this agreement to keep talking to the US about climate change, whether that actually produces anything. At the moment, it seems like an agreement to keep talking. There is some sort of reference to methane, but what that'll involve, I don't know. So it will be fascinating to see. Yeah.
Dennis, we briefly touched on this before when we were talking about the different sort of minerals which go into making renewable energy. But what a lot of people sort of forget when we start to talk about the construction of renewable energy, especially stuff like solar panels and wind farms, like you mentioned, are those minerals, but also stuff like other forms of coal which are used to require to build steel for the wind panels. There's lithium in the battery, which can be very harmful. And a lot of these renewable energy forms only have a half-life of 15 years. Once they're done, where are we going to fix up with them? When do you think we'll start having a discussion on net zero about the actual harmful effects that come from it in the creation of these other resources?
That's a good question. It will need to be fairly soon because, we know that, Scott Morrison talks about 1 in 4 homes have solar panels on the roof now. Now, solar panels only have a limited life. I'm not sure whether it's 10 years or 15 years. A lot of minerals, metals and so on in solar panels. What's going to happen to those? How are they going to be recycled? We can't just dump millions of panels into landfill. So you're right there. It's a very sensitive issue, and it doesn't seem to have got on the public radar at this stage, but it will soon happen. Wind turbines, I assume they'll have quite a long life, although they might have to have some renovations and so on over time. But lithium batteries, how long will a car battery last? I don't know. What about batteries for the home? What about the batteries the huge batteries that are going to be supporting the electricity system put in by the major companies? These things only have a limited life. I don't have the answer, James, but you're right. It's going to be a big issue.
Just quickly continue on from that. There's a common saying that in terms of following down the path of renewable energies, that in trying to save the climate, we're actually damaging the environment because we are using a lot more resources. We're doing a whole amount of land clearing. Sometimes there's levels of bird species being put at threat from the wind farms. Is there a form of energy other than coal or gas which can help us reduce our emissions, but also be safe for both the environment and the climate, that can come to sort of be the pragmatic solution to all of this that you would see?
Well, Australia's lucky, I suppose, in that we've got plenty of land. A lot of it not particularly productive for agricultural purposes and so on, and so that might give us potential to put more solar farms. It comes back to, I suppose, if you're looking for another source of energy, it's nuclear power, and those smaller reactors that I alluded to earlier. We're not talking about huge areas. We're not talking about major cooling towers that people would recoil from. But what do you do with at some point you're going to have to find a way to store the waste, nuclear waste. Then we come back to do we find somewhere in Central Australia to put it underground? It's difficult to find anywhere in Australia to do that. So there's no one. I don't think there's one energy source that we know of apart from the sun that gives you problem-free energy. But we've got to somehow harness the sun's energy, and we do that through solar panels and so on. And we therefore have to use the metals and minerals that we've been talking about. There's no easy solution to these things.
Well, we are now out of time. Former CEO of the New South Wales Minerals Council, Denis Porter, thank you for coming on to Sunday Sessions.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, James.
Thank you. This has been the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast. My name's Andrew, and James has been my co-host for today. We will see you next week. Goodbye.